are going to be a thing that we're going to have to deal with, a high risk. And Obama created inside the White House, a White House office on pandemics, inside the National Security Council. Why? Because it is a matter of national security. You know, nothing has done more devastation to our economy than this nasty virus. And yet we were unprepared. So what happened? What did Trump do? He disbanded that White House office. We knew that markets typically don't prepare well. And so we had national stockpiles. Things like protective gear, masks, ventilators. And what did Trump do? He allowed those stockpiles to be depleted. Again, short-sighted, irresponsible. Finally, we have institutions, and this is really a really important point. We have institutions like the Centers for Disease Control that help us, independent institutions that help us address a contagious disease. And what did he do to that? He defunded it. So it was a concerted attack on government that made it particularly unprepared for addressing not only this risk, but many other risks that we could face. So that's one thing we learned. Secondly, we learned that governments that are not based on expertise, that denigrate expertise, don't do very well. You know, for a social scientist, what's been happening around the world has been extraordinarily interesting. We normally don't have experiments like this. We shouldn't have experiments like this, but what we've seen is how different countries around the world have responded to the disease and responded to the economic aftermath of the disease. And some countries have done really, really well. Democracies in general, strong democracies, have done very well. Examples are New Zealand, Germany, South Korea. They've done well. It's interesting that authoritarian regimes have done very poorly. But Bolsonaro in Brazil is a really good example. It's figures who think that they know it all and don't listen to others, who believe in bluster rather than analysis. And of course, unfortunately, in that list of countries that have not done very well are our two countries. The United States, the worst of the advanced countries, 4% of the population or so, 25% of the cases, the deaths. And inexcusable for a rich country like this. We couldn't produce even the masks, the tests that we needed. We couldn't marshal the resources. We had states competing against each other. It was a disaster. India is another example that has become a poster child of what not to do. So India picked up one idea that was important, lockdown, but then didn't think about what that means in a poor country and how are people going to live. And it led to large numbers of people migrating, moving across the country. One couldn't imagine anything worse for spreading the disease. And you look at the chart of the increase in the incidence of the disease over time, the lockdown had almost no effect, and you are becoming one of the big centers of the disease. So I think there are these common characteristics of authoritarian-like figures not paying attention to science, not engendering trust within their society. And this is an important point about this disease or any contagious disease. Contagious disease involves the spreading of disease from one person to another. And economists would call that an externality. What I do affects you. In societies where there is respect for each other, a sense of social solidarity, trust, individuals behave in ways that respect each other. And that means wearing a mask. But in countries where authoritarian-like figures have made their agenda dividing societies, that kind of respect and trust isn't there. And that's why New Zealand was very successful, and India and the United States and Brazil have been utter failures. A third thing that we have learned, have seen, related to what I talked about just a minute ago, this is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after people who have weak health conditions. And in countries that don't have good systems of social protection, in which there isn't a good public health system, there are a lot more people for this virus to go after. So a remarkable statistic for the United States wasn't there when I talked to you in 2011, but is today, is that the health status of the United States has been going down. There's a beautiful, a very good book by Angus Deaton and Ann Case called Deaths of Despair. On average, life expectancy today in the United States is lower than it was when Trump became the president. Health disparities between the rich and the poor are greater in the United States than in other advanced countries. We have no system of social protection. We don't require paid sick leave. And with half of the country, given the inequality we have, living paycheck to paycheck, if you come down with the disease and can work, you go to work. But that spreads the disease. And to illustrate how selfish American and short-sighted American corporations are, that Congress recognized this was dangerous as this disease spread. But the richest and most powerful firms in the United States lobbied for an exemption of the companies with over 500 employees from the mandate to have paid sick leave. And so what happened? Without paid sick leave, people went to work when they were sick and the disease spread. So there's so many lessons about what is wrong with capitalism American style and what needs to be reformed, that this has been in many ways a teaching moment, not only the way I'll teach my courses, but the way Americans and people all over the world understand the strengths, but glaringly the weaknesses of capitalism American style in the 21st century.
But what led to this? We had governments before this. Obviously the population wanted to vote out those governments and vote in this government. What was the advantage that a populist like Donald Trump could take to get voted in?
Well, I think he was successful for several reasons, and there's been a lot of political commentary over the last 5 years asking exactly your question, and I don't think anybody knows really the answer. But I think setting the stage was this growth in inequality, the fact that large numbers were left behind.
You spoke about in 2011.
That's right. And that the doctrines of the elites said, trust us that globalization and financialization, all these quote reforms will lead everybody to be better off. And it didn't happen. And so what is the natural response? Not to trust those old elites. So part of his success is anti-establishment. You might say, isn't he part of the establishment? He's one of the, claims to be the billionaire. We're not quite sure, but that's what he claims. But he always characterized himself as anti-establishment. He didn't talk like the establishment. He didn't think like the establishment. And so he ran on an anti-establishment platform in an era where large numbers thought the establishment had not served them well. Now, one of the things throughout the ages that when things don't go well, demagogues like Trump blame outsiders, blame minorities within the country. It's a lot easier to say it's them that have done it to us rather than it was a mistake that we made. So that's really been a core part of his campaign, his platform, but it's a characteristic of demagogues. You know, Hitler attacked the Jews. You know, it's just part of what demagogues do. And Trump said it was China, unfair trade agreements. We wrote those agreements. It wasn't like they were pushed on the United States. Those trade agreements were written basically by American corporations.
So, Professor, if I can ask, about the future.
What?
About the future from now. If I can say that, for example, how do we get the economy out of this, COVID thing? Like, for example, in India, we are doing something called Selfreliant India, which is essentially globalization, but first focus on developing Indian industry, which is something that you've written extensively on. So, what would your toolkit be to take a country like India out of this position to make us stronger, larger, more equal economy?
Well, I would begin by trying to create an inclusive society. We have an old motto: a house divided against itself cannot stand. And when you have huge racial divisions in the United States, we are not going to be successful without dealing with those racial divisions. We are not going to be successful if we have these huge income divisions. And Trump has campaigned saying the rural versus the urban, the East Coast and the West Coast versus the center. He's looked for every single divide he can find and try to make it bigger. So it's a politics of division. That is the antithesis of what needs to be done. One has to have a politics of solidarity, and it's that solidarity that enabled people to do better against COVID-19. The same thing for India. Modi has tried to divide your country, Muslims against Hindus. And that is going to undermine your economy, your society, no matter what else happens. It's a fundamental division that will weaken India forever. So that is, if I were saying, where do you begin? That politics of division, get rid of that. That's the danger. Now, on economics, what we've seen is that global supply chains are not resilient. And that's true in the United States, it's true in countries around the world. Again, the private sector was too short-sighted. It focused on saving a few pennies here and there and not taking into account the risks. It was short-sighted in the same way that financial markets were short-sighted in 2008. I give an illustration. We built cars without spare tires. Fine, as long as you don't have a flat tire, but if you have a flat tire, you really realize how important a spare tire is. So we constructed a government and a private sector. Both of them were not resilient, not able to handle the risks, the shocks that any political and economic system have to be able to withstand. So, but that doesn't mean withdrawal from globalization. There are still advantages from taking advantage of comparative advantage, to talk about what Adam Smith and David Ricardo talked about a long time ago. So what we have to do is to be able to take advantage of globalization in ways that don't undermine our economy. That's a more difficult task than the Pollyannish kind of globalization that I criticized in my book, Globalization is Discontent. That view said, just open up markets and everybody is going to be better off. That didn't happen, and predictably so. You know, I had argued it wasn't going to happen. But that was largely a globalization that was for corporations with the rules written by corporations, often in non-transparent ways. And so it was a globalization that multinationals celebrated all over the world, but workers all over the world had to suffer some of the consequences. Not only workers, the environment. It was an unbalanced globalization. So I think going forward, we will have to rethink globalization much more carefully in how we proceed. There's one aspect of it that is two aspects I think I want to mention. The first is the pandemic and climate change has emphasized the need to cooperate. So this goes just against the kind of nativism that Trump has elevated. We do have to cooperate. And it was a big mistake for the United States to withdraw from the World Health Organization. You know, if we're going to fight this virus, we have to do it globally. Nobody will be safe unless everybody is safe. And the international institutions, in many ways, have done a very good job. The IMF, which I've criticized very strongly in some of my earlier work, has been at the forefront in making sure that resources are available to developing countries and emerging markets to fight the virus. They've been advocating strong actions, a $500 billion issuance of special drawing rights, SDRs. It's the United States that's been vetoing this, stopping this from happening. So the multinationals have actually risen to the occasion by and large. So we need cooperation for that and for climate change. So the second issue that concerns me is, you mentioned earlier the Fukuyama end of history, everybody was going to be a liberal democracy. We know that that's not true now, at least not for as far as the eye could see. We're in this difficult world together with climate change and pandemics. We are going to have to learn how to cooperate with countries whose values we disagree with, who are not committed to democracy. And that's going to be the second challenge. A lot of the argument for free trade was it would accelerate the movement towards this end of history, to this world where everybody was a democracy. We don't believe that now, at least not, the evidence of that isn't there. But that doesn't mean we have to learn how to cooperate with people whose values we disagree with.
Right, Professor. I'll ask some of our distinguished members to ask questions. Mr. Sanjeev Puri.
Thank you, Rudra, and thank you, Professor. That was a very insightful initial comments. And I want to just pick on two very important points that you spoke about. One was this whole issue about social inequity, and the second is the issue of climate change and climate risks. Now, over time, we've been seeing a lot of talk about both these issues, both from policymakers as also corporates. We also heard the rise of the ESG investing. The jargons like compassionate capitalism and stakeholder capitalism are also kind of one hears them more often. So my question is that from your perspective, and I'm asking this because I do feel that corporates really have a lot of role to play in also dealing with some of these issues of social inequity and climate change. Do you think that these trends that are happening, are they creating purposive actions in the right direction? Or do you see that there is more of noise and not really sufficient action? I do notice that with ESG investing, one of the things I'm noticing for sure is that they have excluded sectors. So I don't know whether that's the right thing to do or whether it's about saying whichever sector you are on, conduct the business in the right way rather than being in a good sector and conducting the business in the wrong way. So my question is really about how are these trends of ESG investing and various forms of disclosure, are they really contributing to driving the right kind of behavior that will lead to a paradigm where natural capital is replenished and social inequity over a period of time is dealt with?
A good question. Let me say first, for the most part, one needs to have a comprehensive ESG framework, but there are some excluded sectors. I don't think you can have coal in a 21st century economy, which is dealing with climate change, where the whole world has to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. So there are a few sectors that are particularly inconsistent with these major issues of dealing with climate change and other social inequities. There are other sectors that have made their way by exploiting other people. And you might imagine how we could reform exploiting sectors to make them less exploiting. That would be a move in the right direction. But their business model is exploitation. We have to realize that. There are some, in the United States, we have private for-profit universities like Trump University, whose main job was taking advantage of people's aspirations to get ahead. And you can't trust them. You have to have strong regulation. So their ESG is not on its own, is not going to solve it. It will need strong regulation because their business model is exploitation. There's a lot of discussion right now in the United States, I'll share with you, which is should corporations just maximize shareholder value, or should they take a broader agenda, ESG, stakeholder capitalism, worry about the environment, natural capital, the community, workers, customers, a whole array of constituents. And at this point, I think there's a broad consensus in Europe and the United States that there should be this broad stakeholder capitalism. ESG is very important. 50 years ago, Milton Friedman wrote a very influential article saying that it was irresponsible of firms to pay attention to anything other than shareholder value. And I was particularly, when he wrote this, he wrote it in the New York Times. I, roughly at the same time, was writing articles in more mathematically, Journal of Finance, Quarterly Journal of Economics, with my colleagues, Sanford Crispin, and we were explaining why shareholder value maximization did not lead to societal well-being. Well, Friedman had more influence in the short run. He wrote in the New York Times, everybody read it, everybody loved it, especially the capitalists. But a year ago, the Business Roundtable leaders almost unanimously, not unanimously, but almost unanimously, agreed with my perspective, with the broader stakeholder perspective, with the ESG perspective. And there was a very interesting symposium in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago, looking at the legacy of Friedman 50 years later on this issue. And again, almost everybody agreed Friedman was wrong. So I think today we've made progress, but it is still the case that progress is more at the rhetorical level than actual performance. Now, I was at a meeting at Davos where, with a lot of, very influential CEOs, and one of them had, during the previous year, had the insight that he should pay his workers a livable wage. You might say, how did it take you so long to have that insight? But he was talking to the other executives and said, we have to treat our workers and pay them a reasonable wage. If you pay them so low that they can't live, how can they be good workers? So it seems to me that we are at a cusp where there is a broader understanding of what's gone wrong. And hopefully, at least in Europe and the United States, will make the transition to a more progressive capitalism.
Mr. Sanjeev Mehta.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, greetings, Professor. Professor, you have a pretty good idea about the Indian economy, but just to bring you quickly up to date, it's about $2.9 trillion, and it had a good run in the last 3 decades. But post-COVID, in the June quarter, it has contracted by about 24%. The government has done a good job of ensuring that no one goes hungry in the rural area, and which is also visible that the consumption is becoming a bit buoyant in rural area because also of the direct transfer of money, as well as good harvest. Now, the government has been circumspect with spending money because they're worried that the fiscal deficit may go out of control. We don't have deep pockets like the US. Inflation might get out of control, but we need to kickstart the economy. If the government of India comes to you for advice, Professor, what would be your advice?
Very good question. Let me say, there is, as you pointed out, a United States and India, we basically can print money. We're not facing any inflationary pressures. And the case for spending money is compelling because if we don't, there will be long-term damage. Economists call it hysteresis effects. Companies that go bankrupt don't become unbankrupt in 2 years' time. So we, and this is why the Republicans have been very irresponsible for, after there was a strong support, $3 trillion in March, they've refused to give what the economy needs. And suffering is really palpable in the United States. But we don't have the budgetary constraints. But even without those budgetary constraints, I've given the advice, you have to use your money well. The basic law of economics is resources in the end are scarce. Make sure that your money is well targeted to places where it's really needed. And we didn't do that very well. A lot of big businesses that didn't need the money got money. A lot of the small businesses and the most vulnerable didn't get money. So what you described, I haven't followed all the details in India, but what you described is that to some extent, even though the government has not done a good job in controlling the pandemic, it has, the way you've described it, succeeded in getting money to some of the most vulnerable. Now, I've listed the priorities in a couple papers of where government should be spending money. The first priorities are helping the vulnerable, but also containing the disease. So I can tell you what it should have done. It should have helped early on so they didn't have to engage in the kinds of migration that help spread the disease. That's too late now, but spending money in ways that prevent the contagion of the disease and helps people gives a double dividend. It helps the economy, but also helps control the pandemic. And let me say very clearly, you won't control the economic aftermath until you control the pandemic. So for me, that's the first priority, thinking about what you can do and that to control the pandemic, and spending money on that is really important. Now, one of the lessons of economics is targeting is really important. There is some spending that has a big bang for the buck and others that doesn't. And by shifting money from those areas where the impact is high from those where impact is low to those are high, you can maximize the effect even within a budget constraint. But it may be necessary to raise taxes. Nobody wants to raise taxes in the midst of a crisis. But I've argued that if you can't get resources, say from SDRs, from other sources, and you face budget constraints, then one way of dealing with it is raise taxes. If you raise taxes on the very rich, you have a lot of billionaires in India, and spend that money well, it actually stimulates the economy. It's called the balanced budget multiplier. So those are the frameworks that I would begin to discuss the details of the policy.
Thank you.
The next questions would be Professor Sumantra Bose, followed by Mr. Raju Kunoria, and then Mr. Y.K. Modi.
Hi, Professor Stiglitz. Very nice to listen to you. I went to Amherst College too, by the way, class of 1992, a little bit after you. I had an India-specific question, perhaps of broader, global relevance for you. The current Prime Minister of India has been saying repeatedly over the last few months, since about April, i.e. since the pandemic broke and spread around the world, that the new motto or slogan of his government is going to be Atma Nirbharata, or self-reliance. Now, this seems to be something of a rhetorical shift from the kinds of phrases and slogans he used during his first term, where he seemed to be all about a full-blooded, full-throated embrace of global capitalism, including in its postmodern forms like Facebook, etc. And there the main slogan perhaps was Make in India. But now, in the last 5 months or so, he's been repeating this new mantra of Atma Nirbharata, or self-reliance. And sometimes he sounds like a new Gandhi 100 years later. Now, I wonder what you make of this rhetorical shift and how it feeds into the broader political strategy of his government and his party and that party's movement. Is this rhetorical shift something you would have predicted? In any case, what do you make of it? Is it something that populist and what you called authoritarian light leaders can be expected to resort to over a period of time, if not immediately? Or is it something that surprised you, that it's changed from a full embrace of global capitalism in all its forms to this rhetoric of self-reliance?
Very interesting question, and both on the political and the economic dimensions.
Mhm.
Let me just first comment on the economic dimension.
Sure.
No country can be fully self-reliant. We import raw materials that we don't have inside our country. We import technology. The vaccine that seems to be the most likely for success comes from Oxford University, from the UK, not from America. We live in an integrated world where no one is fully self-reliant, and it's a kind of nativism that is out of touch with the 21st century. We have, as I said before, we have to cooperate on climate change, and knowledge is a global public good and spreads all over the world. Your technology, artificial intelligence that you'll be using, much of that will be coming from other countries around the world, including the United States. So the idea of self-reliance is really a rhetorical flourish that is the kind of thing that you almost expect from authoritarian figures, as I described before. It's trying to set you apart from others, and it's a fiction. It doesn't correspond to the way the world in the 21st century. If you did it, your standard of living would start plummeting. If you did it really, so it's a rhetorical flourish, not a reality. I think for India, for the Modi government and for his party, there's a particular problem, and that is the anti-Muslim rhetoric doesn't sit well with many of your neighbors, many people all over the world. The basic Enlightenment values, which have been the source of economic prosperity for the last 250 years, is one of tolerance. That we recognize that people are different. We may not agree, but we develop tolerance. And that means that you not only tolerate, but you respect others. You may engage in debate, try to persuade them, but it is one not of the kind of primitive nativism that has characterized countries in the long distant past and has had such cost. So the way you posed it to me, is that, am I surprised? No, not at all. It is what I've seen elsewhere from demagogues and authoritarian figures. It does concern me, and it concerns me particularly because I worry about the future of India. And we know where the next stage of these demagogues go, and we're already seeing some elements of that. Great concern in the United States and in Europe, which is you start going after those centers of tolerance that try to keep values. And that means in particular going after universities and after professors who advocate tolerance.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Kanoria, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's been a very interesting discussion from your side. I will move away from very specific country-related questions to a more broader question on the point that you raised about the fragility of global supply chains. And I believe that it's because most of the multilateral institutions we have really don't have any teeth in them, in the sense that the legal systems which are governing any kind of trade or any kind of business across the world are largely nationalistic in nature. And the only organization which I believe had actually reached somewhere in terms of at least creating a platform which was more global in nature was the WTO, where the dispute settlement mechanism was something which was accepted across transnational borders. Now, in today's world, I mean, where data and communication and where intellectual property and all kinds of transnational issues which are global in nature are dealt with by laws which are very specific to countries. I mean, what kind of framework is possible to bring about a global understanding? Because we've seen this in the pandemic, that because of the lack of cooperation in the world, I mean, we have a tendency, I mean, it's actually one more, if I'm allowed to say, one more point to actually build on the nationalism theory. And that actually, I don't think I'm a believer in multilateral trade. I believe that trade also would lead ultimately to equality in some form. It hasn't. I accept that point, but I still don't understand how the legal framework can be created across global organizations and countries.
Well, let me begin by saying, within our countries, we have a lot of diversity, each of our countries, and we still go ahead and create legal frameworks, laws. And the rule of law is essential for enabling markets to work. If you didn't have the rule of law, markets couldn't function. And just like we need a rule of law within countries, we need a rule of law governing interactions across borders. So that's why I agree with you that the WTO with dispute resolution mechanism is absolutely vital. And that's why I think what Trump has done, where he's refused to allow the appointment of new judges, has been so disastrous. And I've argued that the rest of the world should just go ahead, appoint new judges. The rest of the world has global cooperation, a rules-based system, even if the United States isn't part of it. We shouldn't let one rogue country or one rogue president destroy the international framework. Now, the second part of your question, in some sense, is the WTO or the rules were established under this era of neoliberalism where corporatism was very dominant. And some of the rules were not ideal rules. I've written about my criticisms in my book, Fair Trade for All, that they weren't good rules. But I feel very strongly that we have a framework for renegotiating those rules to create a better system of rules. That it is better to have a set of rules than the law of the jungle, where the powerful beat up on everybody else and you have chaos. And so I've been very, very strongly in favor of changing the rules. And I mentioned before, the way we change it will reflect the death of neoliberalism. It's no longer a prevailing doctrine, but also the understanding that we are going to be trading with countries with different economic systems. And that means the way the rules are written, we'll have to recognize that there's going to be state capitalism in China and a different kind of economic system in other countries. And so they have to incorporate that diversity. Thirdly, the pandemic itself has highlighted what you said, the importance of global cooperation. The scientists, are cooperating in a way that we've never seen before. They're putting aside their usual concerns about who's first and publication, and they are working day and night to find the answers, the therapeutics, the vaccines, the tests. It's really very impressive. But not so impressive have been the governments. We have in the United States a government who wants vaccine nativism, that doesn't want a set of priorities of where should the medicine vaccines go first in terms of what is good for the world. It's a kind of selfishness that we would not want to see in our children. And I hope we don't. I hope we overcome this period of extreme selfishness, and realizing that global cooperation is the only way we're going to solve common problems like the pandemic and climate change.
Mr. Modi.
Thank you, Rudra. Professor, I've been hearing from you from last 40 minutes, and I can see that you don't like your own president at all, Mr. Trump. But let me assure you, nobody of us is a voter who is going to vote in America. So whether he's good or bad doesn't make a difference to all of us who are hearing here. I think, sir, your knowledge about India, unfortunately, is, if I may say, is driven more by New York Times than by reality. Because you feel that India is anti-Muslim, and China, which is openly goes to UN and says that I am converting Muslims to their own religion, is okay. So I don't know whether you like Chinese kind of capitalism or India and other liberal countries which are growing, which have difficulty, which have poverty, which have differences politically and economically. But I'm sorry to say that Mr. Mehta asked a question that what would you advise our Prime Minister? I think it is lucky that you don't like him, because if you had given him advice to raise taxes, we would be in more trouble than what we are. So besides raising taxes, any other suggestions where we can get out of less demand in our economy and get economics moving?
Well, let me say first that I mentioned before that one of the real challenges for the international community, United States and Europe, is, and it will be crystallized hopefully in the next administration, is how to deal with China. Because what Trump has done has focused on some second order issues. Bilateral trade deficits. No economist thinks that bilateral trade deficits are important. In fact, bilateral trade deficit with China has actually not done particularly well. Multilateral trade deficits are what matter, and the multilateral trade deficit has actually gone up over the course of the Trump administration. But these are not the deepest issues. The deepest issues in dealing with China are going to be the value issues. Democracy in Hong Kong, the treatment of the Uyghurs, and the United States has been, among the Democrats, has been as critical of the mistreatment of the Uyghurs as it has been of what has gone on, or even more critical than what has gone on in India. But the issues of economic science are pretty clear. A balanced budget multiplier, raising taxes and spending the money can stimulate the economy if you do it in the right way. If you take money from people whose marginal propensity to consume is low and give it to people whose marginal propensity to consume is high, it stimulates the economy. And if you, at the same time, spend the money in ways that control the pandemic and build for your future, then you're in a stronger stead. So it's not the New York Times that when you look at India's disastrous performance in controlling the pandemic, it's not the New York Times. This is data that is publicly available from multiple sources. The reality is that India has not done well. And there's lots of discussions about why it's done so badly. But India and the United States, I don't want to put the finger on India, but India, United States, and Brazil are countries that have performed disastrously. And there are models of countries that have done very well. And anybody who is serious about controlling the pandemic and its economic aftermath has to look at what were the common characteristics of the countries that have done well, and what are the common characteristics of the countries that have done poorly.
Mr. Call?
Thank you, Rudro, Professor Stiglitz. I'm enjoying this debate and point of view. I would like to get your view on something, and part of your research has been on market failures, and clearly we have had some very dramatic ones. You yourself have talked about the financial sector growing perhaps too large as a percentage of GDP. But the reality is, to have a broad-based, well-developed economy, you need a sophisticated financial sector. You need these parts of the economy to work. In India, perhaps one of the big problems that we face in development is the financial sector is not broad-based and large enough. Now, I'm going to guess the answer to controlling how large is too large, or mechanisms for breaking up parts that are unnaturally or unfavorably too large, lies in regulation and lies in governance, not necessarily government, but governance. Now, the fact is, who are the people that we rely on to do this governance? How do we align their interests? How do we align their utility curves, their preferences to do what's in the best nature of the economy? And these are areas that you've also researched in a lot of your work. So how do we ensure that, while there is market failure, we prevent issues of governance failures, not merely because of some ulterior or malignant motive, but just from plain old incompetence, from a bureaucrat being in the wrong place at the wrong time, making the wrong decision based on bad information, bad processes, or just a wrong call. Too much power centralized in one individual or a system of individuals. These are issues that I would really love to hear your views on.
Well, first, you're not going to get, human institutions are never going to be perfect. We have to begin with that. So we're going to get market failure. We're going to get government failure. So that's going to be part of what we have to deal with. Transparency can be an important part of minimizing, reducing government failure, creating institutions that work, accountability, democratic accountability. I think also important is respect for the public sector. If there is a war against the public sector that denigrates the public sector, you're going to undermine. You're not going to attract the best quality people to the public sector. So there are good institutions that have been created, they're always going to be fragile, but there are some very good institutions and some that are being created even now. I mean, for instance, in New York State, we've created a green bank in order to facilitate investment, more investment in the green transition. To go back to the market failure of the financial sector, I do think that you need a strong financial sector, but interestingly, the parts of the financial sector that I think have contributed most to US economic growth are remarkably small, and those need to be strengthened. For instance, the venture capital funds. You look at the United States, you all think of Silicon Valley, the technology companies that have flourished there. It's not conventional banking. It's really the venture capital firms that have played a very big role. And they are a very small fraction of the financial sector. The kinds of things that do not contribute to the growth of the economy are payday lenders, parts of the financial sector that focus on exploiting poor people. And unfortunately, or market manipulation. And as you've probably been following, some of our major banks every year get fined huge amounts of money. One of the major banks got fined almost $1 billion just a few weeks ago for engaging in market manipulation. So to get the kind of financial sector you need, I think we need to encourage the parts of the financial sector that have been instrumental in creating new enterprises, new sectors, and discourage those parts of the financial sector which have specialized in exploitation.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, and thank you for all the questions. We want to be sensitive to your time, but let me tell all of you in the audience that Professor Stiglitz loves provocation and loves provocative questions. In fact, the class that we did with Professor Stiglitz, globalization, there was Professor Stiglitz and Professor Greenwald, and we saw the greatest arguments play out in front of us, and that was the fun. We probably are missing Professor Greenwald because Professor Stiglitz was always a little left and Professor Greenwald a little right, and that is what brought the energy, and I think some of the questions brought it out. I think, however, Professor Stiglitz has always been a brilliant conscience keeper of the world, whether as the head of the World Bank, as the most cited economist in the world, and he's still at it, and he's been someone who's always shown us what is the right way of moving ahead. I'll just say, Professor, that in India, of course, we are a poor country. We are fighting hard against the pandemic. And across all stripes of governments, whether in Kerala, whether in Rajasthan, whether in UP, whether in West Bengal, it's been a devastating hit. And it's unfortunately the long-term consequences of not having very good infrastructure. Despite the fact that we didn't, unlike in US, say it is a flu or it's a common cold, or we took it as seriously, and all of us as businesses took a hit, and many of our factories were shut. We were, as business people, continued and by law continued paying wages to all those people despite having zero revenue for several months. So it has been it's been something that the Indian economy has shouldered on the shoulders of all the workers, all the business people, all the professionals but I think there are some positives as well over the last few years. There's been an insolvency and bankruptcy code, which if you may have read, and I think you would appreciate when you read. that people cannot get away with taking away the bank's money. There's been a labor law, which I think was long time coming. Unfortunately, around 14% of India has organized labor, and the other 86% has no rights. So the labor laws actually give rights to labor, whether it's contractual, etc. So there's been, of course, we love heated debates, especially in Kolkata, the city where we are speaking from. This is the city of heated debates, and because we are all sitting at home, we are debating, looking at the computer, thanks to technology. But we are very, very thankful, greatly appreciative of the time you spent with us. And hopefully we'll learn a lot more when you read your book. And hopefully we'll have another chance of welcoming you to Kolkata in person.
Well, thank you. I look forward to coming to Calcutta.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody who joined. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chenoy.
Thank you, Rudra. Well done. Good, very interesting debate with different views.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Rudra.
Thank you, Rudra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining.
Hope Anya is doing well.
Yes, she is. Yes.
Good. Good to see you. Thank you.
Right.